Thank you, Sharon. Good afternoon, and thank you for this invitation, and it's a privilege to be able to come to this fantastic place and present my work. My work is a bit different from the papers that have been presented today, but I'm trying to relate to how this idea of education and peace building is linked with the notion of leisure and somehow I think peace. I guess in a broad sense there's a connection, but I try to approach my work from much wider sociological, political and economic perspectives. So what I'll try to do is to provide a much wider picture of how education and society are interrelated, and how education impacts on society, and how societal dimensions impact on education. So in that sense, this is going to be an intervention from much wider micro level, global level theoretical position. I would like to start by a Sanskrit verse thousands of years ago written, which values education as an extremely important element for a society. I will translate that into English, but I'll say this first in Sanskrit. Nachaurya harim, nacharaja harim, nabhati bhajam natabharakari, be krute vartate eva nityam, vidyadhanam sarvadhanam pradhanam. What this really means is the wealth that cannot be stolen, neither abducted by state, neither snatched by state, nor can be divided among brothers, neither it is burdensome to carry. The wealth that increases by giving, that wealth is education, is supreme of all possessions. So this basically establishes in the history of humankind in the Eastern society that education is the only wealth that everyone should be aspiring to achieve. In modern societies, I think this philosophy still holds relevance, that we believe that education is a positive force for social change and in advancement of human civilization. That's why we believe in education, we invest in education across the world. After 1950s, and I think the international development, in the discourse of international development, investment in education is precisely around this idea that the backwardness of some of the underdeveloped countries, the term that used to be used in those times, that through investment in education, through modernization, societies would enhance and people would be able to improve their livelihood. However, if you look at education from the point of view of conflict, it can be problematic. What I'm trying to present today is that education is not only a positive force, it basically creates conducive environment for violent conflicts to emerge. So education has a negative face as well. But in this process, I think what I try to do is to look at this interrelationship between education, conflict, and peace building from three perspectives. First, when we think about education and conflict, we think that education becomes a victim in violent conflict. Children are attacked, schools are destroyed. Education is basically caught in the middle of violent conflict. So the first notion is that education is a victim of conflict. What has happened in the last couple of decades is the nature of conflict has changed from interstate wars to intrastate civil wars. So the battles are fought within the nation states now. So as a result, what I call it is on demarcation of the battlefield. Traditionally, it would be easy to kind of locate where the conflict was happening, but now conflict is happening everywhere. And it can happen anywhere. So that is the kind of sense of fear that it has created in our society. 50 million primary and secondary school-aged children living in conflict-affected countries are out of school, which is 50% of the total number of children who are out of school. So this is really a colossal problem for the international community, which basically has promised to provide universal access to education for children, where it had the goal to achieve it by 2015, that some progress has been made, but conflict is one of the biggest barriers to achieving the primary education goal. Education is under attack not just by the rebel forces, but also by the state authorities. A lot of examples we can think of, such as in Colombia, Mexico, Gaza, Nepal, where I've worked for several years, that state forces have also attacked on education, on schools, teachers, and children. I'll come to that in a minute, about the reasons why they're attacked. We've also seen in the most recent years that education is increasingly becoming a tool for achieving military goals, right? So traditionally, education was a long-term investment in order to transform society in the long term. But now education has become part of a short-term strategic or military strategic goal in many contexts. For example, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, US military invested directly through education in building schools and funding children's scholarships, etc., and going out there in the communities, working with the civil society organizations in providing education. So it looks quite positive on the surface, but the motivations and the objective of that kind of engagement can be much more problematic if we are thinking from civilian perspectives, that the goal of education is not to just achieve, not to win the war, if you see what I mean. And also the way that investment comes to education also changes its nature, and the priorities shift, and long-term commitments basically decline if you think from that point of view. But also education is important in humanitarian context. That in 1996, Grassa Merkel wrote a report, the impact of armed conflict on children, basically shifted the way that the international community saw education in conflict-affected context. That a lot of international development programs, particularly focusing on education, started prioritizing child protection, guaranteeing the access to education and continuing education even during conflict. But also, education was seen as a tool, as a space where vulnerable populations, including girls, could be protected through safe environment. Education also provides much wider, longer-term skills and knowledge. For example, critical thinking skills, active citizenship, problem-solving, human rights education. These elements which are provided to children in those fragile contexts or humanitarian contexts are useful much later in their lives, and therefore education is important, and there is therefore a campaign called Education Cannot Wait. But when you look at education from conflict and development point of view, because we've now kind of established that education is a way of shifting the problematic social and economic conditions in societies, then when conflict is brought into that equation, it becomes a bit problematic. Education is usually seen as economic investment. So poverty is a cause of conflict. So investment in education will enable societies to create economic activities, create job opportunities, and therefore it will reduce the chances of conflict. That is the logic of a human capital theory. So if you look at the research in 1980s, which basically establishes that investment in primary and secondary education provides a much larger educational outcomes in the longer term, and as a result, it reduces the chances of conflict. What it doesn't talk about is the inequalities that are created through the process of human capital thinking, and also prioritization of capitalism as a solution to global problems. Then what we saw in 1990s is this capabilities approach, that economic development is important, but also it is important to acknowledge gender equity, ethnic identity, issues around language, culture, and recognition for all those kind of elements are important, because societies that have gone into conflict have this called horizontal inequalities, not just the vertical inequalities, inequalities across different social groups who live in the same society. And it's to do with these structural issues. So development should intervene in those unequal socio-economic structures in order to achieve better outcomes. But the third thinking is more about, well, education is important, but when international development thinking drives agenda for education, then there is a dominance of Western ideology in education. So international development is seen as an apparatus for ideological manipulations. Like previously, there used to be empires, but now those have been kind of changed through more development aid and more strategic and international relations affairs. And therefore, that kind of well-intended agendas in education are also being rejected. So what we saw in Nigeria is the emergence of Boko Haram, which basically means Western education is bad, is to kind of resist educational programs which are being supported by the state and also by international organizations. Yeah, in Afghanistan we can see similar kinds of problems. But also at the same time, education is also, development and education are positive interventions for societies to make them much more critically aware of their social, political, and economic conditions. So development is a success for conflict. So in this notion, conflict is not necessarily bad, because it's about resistance. It's about securing the rights that people deserve. So, conflict and revolution. If you think about these two terms, revolution and movements are seen much more positively, because they are seen as changing societies for the wider community, whereas conflict is seen as a negative, right? So both may have the elements of violence. But education is also a perpetrator. I think some of the things that I talked about, how Western education is labeled that way, can be a problem, is education is seen as a perpetrator of violence. More specifically, unequal distribution of education across societies create conditions where certain socio-economic cultural groups are more advantaged than the others. So in societies where there are social hierarchies, whether they are caste-based hierarchies or racial hierarchies, unequal access to education will create economic conditions in society where only the privileged populations will benefit from the opportunities. So what happens is inequalities are exacerbated. So if education is not able to address those types of problems, then education is basically creating or perpetuating those conditions. Pierre Bourdieu talks about this idea of cultural reproduction. I think in sociology and education, I think we often deal with these notions. That he says, education, one of the most effective means of perpetuating the existing social pattern, as it both provides an apparent justification for social inequalities and gives recognition to the cultural heritage, that is, to a social gift treated as a natural one. Yeah? So I think we said this morning mentioned about children come to the classroom with a whole range of baggage in them, right? And providing equal treatment to all children is not necessarily going to produce equitable educational outcomes, right? I think from that point of view, we need to understand education in a context where it is located and the surroundings where it is situated. They all constantly impact on the way that education takes place. But if we look at post-colonial societies where these societies have become independent, for example, India, if you see, or Zimbabwe, in other places, even after the independence, there is a powerful complete control of social, political, and cultural domains. These actors either have participated in resistance of the colonial empire or have actually worked together with the empire, and that legacy continues. And as a result, you see a very strong, families of political parties, like father and son and grandson, continuing the leadership in politics in many countries. Like Kenya, you can see elections going on at the moment. So my argument is people have never been liberated, that people haven't really enjoyed the power, which was basically the intention of the independence. And when that happens, a famous sociologist, James Ferguson, says that if the prospect, he says that 30 years ago when I went to Namibia, people used to ask me, how do I make my country like yours? Right? And after 30 years, when he visits Namibia, people ask him, how do I get out of this country? Right? So this tells a lot. And the problem is that the bottom pile of the society in these countries haven't been able to transform their economic and social conditions. As a result, we see increasing amount of conflicts across these nation states. But if you look at more specifically on the education sector, I think corporal punishment is still a powerful tool of disciplining children. In private education in Nepal and in some other parts such as in South Asia, I think which are actually argued to have produced good results against the public education systems, practice corporal punishment and then strict disciplining strategies. And education also is a weapon of cultural repression. So the national education system, which basically aspires to homogenize language, culture, and social values, as a process of nation building, can actually upset some of the minority communities who may have had their cultural heritage or language heritage, who feel cheated, who feel excluded from the opportunity to be represented. And education from that point of view becomes a problem. I think history, again, all we know is a problem in education. So who writes history? We're talking about the Nanking massacre over the lunch this afternoon. The way that Nanking massacre is taught in China is very different from the narrative you experience in Japan. Right? So the history of empire, which is taught in Britain, is very different from the way that it is taught in India. My colleague Marie Lau has written a paper about how India and Pakistan teach different narratives of history, to kind of consolidate national identity of their own populations. Basically, this is India and Pakistan always have had tension. So she argues that these countries basically educate their populations to hate each other, right? So history is again a problem from that point of view. Education has a negative face. Textbooks are always manipulated because if you see, the state is always very possessive about the curriculum, the language of instruction, etc. So in Lebanon, where I work, it is so difficult for providing access to education for Syrian children because of the language barrier that the Lebanese government teaches in English or in French, whereas Syrian children have Arabic. And the state is not able to provide the education needed for almost 60% of the Syrian children who are out of school. The state doesn't have the capacity, but it doesn't want to give up its control over education to other stakeholders in providing education. Because education leads to national identity, and I think from that point of view, state feels quite strongly about it. And I think self-worth and hating others is another underpinning ideological resistance in all education systems. And I think national glorification, wherever we come from, is an important part of the education system. I was brought up in Nepal where right from the start, and I learned that Nepal was the most beautiful country in the world, right? Maybe not, there are so many other beautiful countries in the world, and it took quite some time for me to realize that. So, it's I think in every culture, that kind of systematic process of ideological positioning happens, and I think from that point of view, the criticality about learning about history, your position, your place, your society is lost. But education is also a means for liberation, and I think one of the points I mentioned earlier is that this idea of social reproduction is quite limited because the existing education system, which is meant to reproduce socioeconomic hierarchies, basically also produces some of the actors who challenge the system itself. It also produces oppositional groups within the education system. So learners and teachers are active participants within the hegemonic curricula and can exercise anti-hegemonic pedagogies. So education is a critical space, which Tejendra Pherali talks about. It is a way of conscientization, that making people critically aware of their social, political, and economic conditions in order to take proactive action to change those unequal structures. So Johann Galton, a peace theorist, talks about two different types of violence. Direct violence, which is the physical violence, and indirect violence, which is much more difficult to see. For example, poverty, hunger, discrimination, like apartheid, like in South Africa, etc. The dominant policy framework today focuses on securing stability, which Galton argues that is negative peace. There may be absence of physical violence, but the causes of more indirect violence have not been addressed properly, and therefore there is absence of positive peace. So in order to build positive peace, and I think there is a need for going beyond the cessation of violence, going beyond and addressing some of the conditions and causes that basically give rise to conflict. And I think this is a useful framework to analyze peace, the positive peace. In terms of building positive peace, education can actually bring people together from across dividing lines. Peace education is an important aspect within peace-building education, which can actually promote a culture of peace. Also, it helps to sensitize some of the discriminations, marginalization, and exclusion that happens in society, and also it could be within the education system. And therefore, education needs to be seen from a much more wider perspective rather than from just the technical perspectives with regards to maybe funding education, teacher training, or changes in pedagogies, etc., in curriculum reforms. Those are important, but I think that system needs to be looked at from a much wider perspective. Some of the research we did in Cambodia and Nepal shows that people conceptualize peace building in different ways. So one of the ways of thinking about is more pacification, right? Ensuring that there is no violence. But the other way of thinking about it is much more sort of transformation of those societal conditions. So some of the quotes say here, as we have experienced war so much, peace at any cost is important. I deliver a speech to my teachers and students every week to talk about consequences of war, right? So I think there is a danger in saying that we have had war in the past and therefore we need to ensure peace at any cost. A lot of problems emerge out of the manipulative elite group that capitalizes on those kinds of narratives in order to pacify people for some of the challenges that may pose. Whereas if you look at the other side, tolerance has limitations and it can burst when it gets to an extreme level. Conflict erupted because of poverty, social exclusion, and long-standing cultural repression, not just because people were, by nature, biologically violent, right? So maintaining stability doesn't take us to the positive peace. So some colleagues have actually, I'm going to skip that, some colleagues in Sussex, Amsterdam and Ulster actually developed this framework building upon Nancy Fraser's work on social justice, where this has been applied in education in the sense that the education system needs to address the problems of inequalities, the distribution of resources, non-recognition of different ethnic and social groups, and also the limited reconciliation program. So they proposed this 4R framework, which basically argues that education can facilitate redistribution of resources in order to address the problem of inequities. It can also facilitate recognition of diversity, whether it is ethnic, caste-based, or regional diversity. Then it also needs to facilitate representation, that different social, economic, and cultural groups are represented in the processes of decision-making. And then in post-conflict societies, education needs to play an important role in facilitating dialogue, whether it is truth and reconciliation, or it is having regular dialogues about debating about the issues of the causes of conflict and how non-adversarial approaches can be applied in dealing with conflict. So education is an important space in order to do that. So finally, I think what I would argue is that education can be a key force for unifying people from across dividing lines and transforming the culture of violence. However, it can also generate favorable conditions for violent conflict. Recognizing this complex role of education enables us to address the negative face of education and enhance its socially constructive impact. So in this presentation, I've demonstrated that education is both a victim and a cause of conflict, but more importantly, it can play a key role in rebuilding post-conflict societies and nurturing the culture of mutual respect and peace. While education must be protected from violence, recognizing the broader context, for example, cultural, economic, political, and social, within which education is situated, leads us to understand education as a transformative force. The knowledge, ideologies and perspectives that are represented by our major educated institutions in society are partial representations of social reality, which simultaneously frame, fragment and distort the perceptions and concerns of more subordinate groups. They inherently legitimize the thinking and monopoly of the dominant political class. It is the task of peace-building educators to systematically challenge learners and provide them with the necessary intellectual tools to question dominant structures that reproduce inequalities and normalize injustices. Post-conflict educational contexts can and should provide such a free space for transformative educators. And finally, I'd like to finish by quoting J. Krishnamurti, a philosopher in India. And he says, technical knowledge, however necessary, will no way solve our inner psychological pressures and conflicts. And it is because we have acquired technical knowledge without understanding the total process of life that technology has become a means of destroying ourselves. The man and woman who knows how to split the atom but has no love in his heart becomes a monster. Thank you.
So, and if you want to ask a question or have